Three or More is a Riot is a collection of Jelani Cobb's pieces for The New Yorker magazine written between 2012 and this year. Describing it, Cobb frames it as an account of the backlash to the election and presidency of Barack Obama. At the end of the book, he reflects on his experience of rereading his own journalistic writings at a distance in time and selecting which to include in the book. He says, reading this work inspired a reckoning not simply with what I wrote, but with who I was when I wrote it. I would like to believe that I've served as the stoic chronicler of events, but in fact, I did not stand still either. Times change and times change us. In retrospect, the work included here is unintentionally autobiographical. The person who pondered the meaning of Trayvon Martin's death was fundamentally more optimistic than the one who wrote about George Floyd's nearly a decade later. Also, I left out a few things. A cardinal ethic of journalism is the recognition that the story is not about us, the journalists. This is a good and fine principle that encourages reporters to fulfill our primary mission, to tell the stories of others who might not otherwise be heard. Yet it is also true that, as with all humans, we exist in dynamic dialogue with our circumstances. And then he gives some examples of personal experiences he had in the course of researching and writing those pieces that were part of his story as a writer, but that he left out of the published piece because, by journalistic standards, they didn't belong there. And then he recalls an important learning experience he had in college. In the spring semester of 1988 at Howard University, I took a class called Black Diaspora, taught by Professor Adele Patton. The course satisfied a prerequisite that all students take at least one course related to the histories and cultures of people of African descent. I showed up without any sense of what to expect, but over the course of those 15 weeks, my understanding of the world was fundamentally rewired. We covered the transatlantic slave trade and the comparative slaveries of North America, South America, and the Caribbean. We learned about what it had taken to extract black emancipation from those same slaveholding societies and mechanisms of African colonization that came in its wake. We concluded with a survey of decolonization in Africa and the Caribbean. Dr. Patton did not teach history the way that I'd experienced previously, as an inert set of facts to be memorized. History was being rendered as a dynamic set of relationships between past and present. We were not being taught simply to fulfill a civic obligation, but rather to better our odds of survival in the world around us. We were being taught how to recognize patterns that might reassert themselves in the present. Storms, they were trying to tell us. Don't stand still. And he says of the book, my hope is that it contributes just a little to our ability to recognize patterns that are reasserting themselves, and maybe even helps discern where the storms are heading next. You'll recall, of course, that Barack Obama's campaign gave expression to hope as capacity. Yes, we can. And you'll probably also recall Speaker John Boehner's subsequent rant on the House floor, hell no, you can't. And somehow we were all so surprised when Donald Trump won the 2016 election, and so stressed for years after, even to this day. That my college education, also during the 1980s, full as it was with history classes, you'll not be surprised to learn, I didn't have the sense that my Cornell professors were trying to teach me how to better my odds at survival in the world around me. That it was different at Howard in exactly that way says a lot about why we have and still need historically black colleges and universities. Choosing hope gets complicated when the efforts of the rich and powerful are bent on oppressing you. And when it gets to the point that it has reached today, where politics is primarily transactional, violence is at once condemned and perpetrated by the state, norms of civility and respect, and even of democracy and civility and respect, and even of democracy and freedom, these are flouted. Diversity is demonized, and our institutions of all kinds are undermined and corrupted. Well, complicated seems an inadequate description of the experience. More than once recently in the press or on social media, I have come across that well-known quotation by Martin Niemöller, that conservative Lutheran pastor who in 1934 helped create the Confessing Church, an anti-Nazi alternative to the state church in Germany. Most recently, it was in an article in The Atlantic by Peter Venner, titled "The Intellectual and Moral Decline of the American Right." You know the quote. "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unions, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. They came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." That's a poignant argument for understanding hope as capacity, if ever there was one. Act now while you still can. A couple of weeks ago, I referred to an essay by James Luther Adams titled "Taking Time Seriously." In that essay, published in 1939, 5 days after the German invasion of Poland that began World War II, he mentions having met not so long before, 3 or 4 years earlier, and talked with not only Niemöller, but also with his enemies and with leaders in the German Christian and pagan movements. He said, "I learned what the existential attitude is in a situation where the options are living options. I learned the meaning of decision and commitment." And then he went to visit Rudolf Otto, who was in retirement and whom he had the good fortune to see for an hour or two a day throughout the summer. "The struggle of the church," he said, "was never for long out of our conversation." Otto, of course, is best known for his mystical theology, his idea that a sense of mystery, what he called the numinous, underpins all religions. I mentioned when I talked about this essay before that an English theologian with the improbable name of Baron Friedrich von Hugel had influenced Adams' thought. Among von Hugel's many contributions to 20th century theology was his idea of the 3 elements of religion. He wrote of a traditional and institutional element, that of a religion's inherited practices and polity, of a speculative and intellectual element, that of its discourse and teachings, and a mystical or experiential element, that of its impact on one's inner life and spiritual development. Throughout Adams's essay, these categories crop up again and again, but with a perception of them all as references to history. Adams comments on one point, "Von Hugel had increased in me a sense of the past, which gave perspective to immediate interests, but he had no theology of social salvation." When we today anxiously lament the danger to which our democracy is now exposed, that's the kind of thing Adams meant by a theology of social salvation. What does our faith have to say about the kind of society we ought to live in? What sort of social order is life-giving? Possibly it was Adams's very conservative Protestant upbringing that made him miss the connection between von Hugel's mystical element and what in his essay Adams himself calls taking time seriously, which he later came to call the prophethood of all believers. The mystical and the prophetic are two sides of a coin. How one lives and moves in the world as one's best self, living a big tree life, all parts integrated as a life-giving whole to oneself and one's neighbors. And how one lives and moves in service to bending the arc of history toward justice, or in Adams's phrase, toward social salvation. Both belong to the experiential and indeed experimental element of religion as we learn and try to live ever more into our core values. In such experience and experiment, we meet the mysterious, the numinous aspects of spiritual growth, that which Otto said underpins all religion. It has long been common for Unitarian Universalists to speak of our spiritual journeys, that journey often involves a crisis, an experience of moral crisis or spiritual confusion, or maybe more than one, of losing the true path of either personal or social salvation. At the beginning of his Divine Comedy, Dante, at the midpoint in his life, describes being lost in a dark wood. A selva oscura is the Italian. And rather like Adams in his essay, he recounts the various people who in writing or conversation have given him guidance. The great mystic of the early modern period, St. John of the Cross, describes this sort of journey in his great poem, I Came into the Unknown. He wrote, I came into the unknown and stayed there unknowing, rising beyond all science. I did not know the door, but when I found the way, unknowing where I was, I learned enormous things. But what I felt I cannot say, for I remained unknowing, rising beyond all science. It was the perfect realm of holiness and peace. In deepest solitude I found the narrow way, a secret giving such release that I was stunned and stammering, rising beyond all science. I was so far inside, so dazed and far away, my senses were released from feelings of my own. My mind had found a surer way, a knowledge by unknowing, rising beyond all science. And he who does arrive collapses as in sleep, for all he knew before now seems a lowly thing, and so his knowledge grows so deep that he remains unknowing, rising beyond all science. The higher he ascends, the darker is the wood. It is a shadowy cloud that clarified the night. And so the one who understood remains always unknowing, rising beyond all science. This knowledge by unknowing is such a soaring force that scholars argue long but never leave the ground. Their knowledge always fails the source to understand unknowing, rising above all science. This knowledge is supreme, crossing a blazing height, though formal reason tries, it crumbles in the dark. But one who could control the night by knowledge of unknowing will rise beyond all science. And if you wish to hear, the highest science leads to an ecstatic feeling of the most holy being. And from his mercy comes his deed to let us stay unknowing, rising beyond all science. In other words, the way forward toward hope when the efforts of the rich and powerful are bent on oppressing us, the way toward what Adams called social salvation, relies on more than reason or tradition. It relies on a sort of I know it when I see it sense of justice and neighborly love, but the way is dark, so it's more like I know it when I feel it. And it is our sense of having felt it in our lives and in ourselves, as well as in the kind of community that we call the beloved community, where we are not only realizing our best selves, but also bringing out the best in each other. That lets us know the patterns that bring on storms and those that protect us from storms. And then we know again our capacity to survive and help and save and bend the arc of society back towards justice and love. And when we know again that capacity, we know how to choose hope. Choosing hope is choosing to live at our best, to be our best selves, to be together as close to the ideal of that beloved community as we can be, and to act according to love and justice as our best values teach us. To choose hope is to be the change we want to see in the world around us. So the connection between the inner and outer journeys is the key to choosing hope. We have to reach deep into the well of our souls, draw out of the dark the knowledge of unknowing, and know it when we feel it insights into ourselves and into life and into the world and its patterns, and faithfully, again and again, choose hope. So may it be for each of us and all of us. Amen.
I now invite Sharon Boyd Struthers back to extinguish our chalice. Please join in saying our closing words. Go out into the world in peace. Have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the suffering. Honor all beings.
And may you choose hope and pass on the light.